raging fire devoured the newly built center. Dogs cried out in the smoke, and Bean the scarred Malinois charged into the inferno to save a fragile life. Michael, trapped in his wheelchair, screamed his name in despair while Emily wept amidst the chaos. In that moment, the entire town seemed to stop breathing. Subscribe now to catch our most gripping and emotional storytelling films. The storm had begun its slow crawl down from the mountains hours earlier, gathering strength in the kind of silence that felt older than the land itself. By midnight, the forest around the Bitterroot Range had surrendered to it. Pines bent beneath the weight of new snow, their branches snapping under the frozen burden. The wind cut across the valley floor like a blade howling as it slipped through canyons and between trees. It wasn't the kind of storm that merely arrived. It invaded, pressing against the walls of every house, reminding everyone foolish enough to live here how small they truly were. Michael Harris sat alone in a log cabin that had seen better years. His body still as stone, his eyes shadowed and hollowed by more than the dim light. The place was a shell much like the man who lived inside it. Timber walls, faded and worn, bore scars of long winters, the wood dry and splintered. A single kerosene lamp flickered weakly on a side table, its flame fighting against drafts that slipped through cracked window frames. The room smelled of stale smoke and spilled liquor. In the corner, a wheelchair sat like a throne of defeat. Its frame was scuffed, one armrest duct-taped, its wheels squeaking whenever he shifted. Michael occupied it like a prisoner occupies a cell's shoulder-slumped blanket thrown over his lap as though it could hide the truth beneath it. His legs, unmoving, rested uselessly on the metal footplates. The empty bottle of bourbon on the table leaned against a stack of unopened mail, most envelopes stamped with VA insignia or hospital logos. Michael hadn't opened them in months. He didn't need to. He already knew what they said: therapy appointments. He wouldn't attend medication refills he refused to take, reminders of a body that no longer obeyed him and a mind that no longer trusted itself. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, there was no battle, only surrender. Michael's silence was thicker than the snow pressing against the cabin walls. He turned his gaze to the window. Frost spiderwebbed across the glass, turning the night into a distorted blur of white flurries and skeletal trees. Somewhere out there, coyotes howled, their cries muffled by the wind. Once, a sound like that would have set him on edge, ears pricked, hand reaching for a rifle pulse, surging into combat readiness. Now it barely stirred him. The man who had been trained to respond to every threat with precision and force was gone, leaving behind a hollow version that simply endured. The clock on the wall ticked. A sound so small, yet in the silence, it was deafening. Michael leaned back, closing his eyes. For a moment, it seemed like sleep might take him, but sleep rarely came gently anymore. When it did, it dragged ghosts with it. And tonight, as his head tilted and his breathing slowed, the ghosts arrived again. Sand, heat, screams. The desert sky burned orange, as if the sun itself had split open. Dust clung to his teeth and tongue. His ears rang from the explosion so sharp it felt like knives digging into the base of his skull. Michael remembered the convoy. The 3 Humvees lined up along the narrow road outside of Fallujah. The call that had come too late. And then impact. A thunderclap of fire and twisted steel. The earth had opened beneath them, swallowing sound, swallowing light, until all that remained was chaos. He could still hear Ramirez shouting, Mike, get down." But there was no down. Only sideways, only weightlessness, only the crushing force of metal tearing into his body as the blast hurled him into oblivion. When he tried to move, nothing responded. His legs were gone before he even understood what had happened. The only thing he felt was the searing agony of shrapnel carving into muscle and bone. Then the voice again. Ramirez's voice. Closer, desperate. "I got you, man. Hold on. Don't close your eyes." But Ramirez never finished that sentence. The second blast silenced him. Michael's eyes snapped open in the cabin. Breath ragged, sweat cold against his temples despite the freezing air inside. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair with enough force to whiten his knuckles. For a second, he couldn't breathe. He couldn't remember where he was, desert or forest fire or snow. His chest rose and fell, lungs stuttering like an engine choking on fumes. When the room steadied again, when the ghosts retreated to their corners, he swallowed hard and looked around. Still in the cabin, still alive, still alone, he reached for the bottle out of instinct, forgetting he had drained it hours earlier. His fingers touched nothing but the rim of glass. He let his hand fall to his lap, the hollow clink echoing in the silence. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that it might have been better if the blast had finished the job. But the voice was old, so old, He didn't even fight it anymore. He wheeled himself closer to the fireplace. The embers had long since died, leaving only the smell of char and ash. He considered adding another log, but didn't bother. Cold didn't scare him. Cold was predictable. It didn't scream. It didn't bleed. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single framed photo. The glass cracked diagonally across the image. It showed Michael in uniform, fresh-faced, standing with a woman whose smile was full and radiant, her arm wrapped around his waist. In her other arm, a little girl, maybe 5 years old at the time, grinned with gap-toothed joy. His wife, his daughter, both gone now. Not gone in the way Ramirez was gone, but gone all the same. His wife had left after the hospital, after months of watching him drown in silence, unable to reach him. She had taken Emily with her, promising letters, visits. Promises that faded as quickly as his body had failed him. Michael stared at the cracked photo until his eyes blurred. He didn't remember when he had last seen Emily. Was it her 9th birthday? 10th time had blurred like smoke, leaving only guilt and anger behind. The wind slammed against the cabin wall, rattling the window panes. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward. His reflection fractured in the photo's broken glass. His jaw was heavy with untrimmed stubble, his hair grown long and wild. The man who had once been a weapon sculpted by training, sharpened by combat, was now a relic. A forgotten soldier in a forgotten cabin. Outside, the storm screamed louder, and the cabin creaked under the weight of it. But inside, Michael remained still, a ghost tethered to wood and wheels, waiting for nothing. Minutes dragged like hours. He thought of nothing. He felt nothing. That was the safest way. Because the moment he let himself feel anger, grief, regret, the battlefield would come roaring back. He shifted in his chair, pulled the blanket tighter over his legs, and stared into the dark. The storm had made the world vanish, but it didn't matter. His world had already ended years ago on a desert road, half a world away. And so, as the snow piled against his door and the wind clawed at the seams of his cabin, Michael Harris, once a Navy SEAL, once a husband, once a father, sat in silence waiting, though he no longer knew for what. Not for rescue, not for hope, maybe just for the end. But outside that night, in the white blur of the storm, something else was moving. Something wounded, limping, yet determined. A shadow against the snow, a heartbeat against the silence. It wasn't coming for shelter. It wasn't coming for warmth. It was coming for him. The sound came first as a faint scrape, almost indistinguishable from the storm pressing against the cabin. At first, Michael thought it was a branch dragged across the siding by the wind, another groan of wood beneath winter's weight. But then it came again, sharper this time. Deliberate. A claw against wood. He froze. The cabin had no visitors. Not in 10 years. Sarah, the woman from town who used to bring groceries, had long since stopped. The mailman didn't drive this far anymore. No neighbor dared the road when snow piled high. The scrape at his door didn't belong here. Michael gripped the armrest of his wheelchair, his breath shallow. His mind leapt instantly back to foreign deserts, to nights when strange noises meant ambush, when silence broke into fire. But this wasn't Fallujah. This was Colorado. This was supposed to be silence. The sound came again. This time, not just a scrape, but a low thud followed by the faintest whine. Michael's jaw tightened. He wheeled himself toward the door muscles in his shoulders straining. The old floorboards groaned under his weight. When he reached the entry, he stared at the handle pulse ticking fast against his throat. He didn't move to open it. Instead, he listened. Another whine. He swallowed. Something alive. Against the roar of the storm, the sound carried a weight that unsettled him. It wasn't a coyote. The pitch was wrong. Not a bear. Not human either. With a slow breath, he unlatched the deadbolt. The metal clicked, echoing in the silence, like a rifle cocking. His hand trembled as he pushed the heavy door open against the drift of snow. The cold rushed in like a fist. Wind bit at his face, carrying shards of ice that stung his skin. For a moment, the white blur of the blizzard blinded him. But then, through the snow, a shape emerged. A dog. It stood at the threshold body, trembling from cold. Chest rising and falling with the labored rhythm of exhaustion. Its coat, dark and wet, clung to muscles shaped by years of training. The breed was unmistakable Belgian Malinois, military stock. The animal's left side bore a jagged wound fur matted with blood that had begun to freeze. One ear hung half-torn. Snow crusted across its muzzle. Its eyes, those eyes cut through the storm like two shards of iron. Not begging, not pleading, just looking. Michael's throat tightened. He knew those eyes. Not this dog's eyes specifically, but The look of a soldier who had seen too much and survived when he shouldn't have. For a long moment, they stared at one another. The wind howled between them, tugging at the doorframe, but neither moved. "Get out of here," Michael muttered, voice rough from disuse. The dog didn't move. Michael tried again, louder this time, forcing steel into his tone. "Go on, get." The Malinois stood its ground. Snow clung to its legs. Blood stained its paw. It neither barked nor whined, only stared unflinching. Something about that silence unnerved him more than any growl would have. He knew what it was like to be broken, but not begging. Michael tightened his grip on the doorframe. He should close it. Push the dog back into the storm. This wasn't his problem. He could barely keep himself alive, let alone a half-dead animal. But the dog sat down. Just like that, folded onto the porch with slow deliberation, eyes still locked on him. A soldier refusing orders. Michael's breath shuddered. He felt anger rise in him, hot and jagged. Anger because the dog wouldn't leave. Anger because its eyes reminded him of his own reflection in the cracked photo on the mantel. "You don't know me," Michael said, his voice shaking. "You don't want to know me." The Malinois blinked once, slowly, then settled its chin against its paws, a statue in the snow. Michael's hands trembled against the wheelchair. He should turn away. He should close the door. But he didn't. He just sat there staring at the animals, staring back at him, the storm screaming around them like some unseen chorus. The silence between them thickened. The air smelled of iron and snow. Images crashed into Michael's mind. Without warning, Ramirez, blood in the sand, the Humvee engulfed in fire. His chest constricted, breath shallow. He closed his eyes, willing it away. But when he opened them, the dog was still there. Still watching. 2 soldiers, both broken, both left behind. Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Hell of a pair we make." The Malinois shifted not in fear, but in stubborn patience. Michael's body ached as he leaned forward. The storm pushed harder against the open-door snow, spraying into the cabin. He should have been cold, but heat rose through his chest, the kind that comes when old scars ache. He tried one more time, voice a whisper now. "Go. Don't stay here." But the dog did not move. Instead, it lifted its head, eyes narrowing, ears, twitching against the storm. Then slowly, it pushed itself upright, wincing as its injured side strained. It stepped once toward him, paws leaving crimson smears against the snow. Michael's hands curled into fists. Something inside him shifted. Something he hadn't felt in years, a pull fragile, but undeniable. The dog stopped at the threshold. It didn't cross. It simply stood there, the line between them, as sharp as the doorframe, its gaze unrelenting. The storm roared, shaking the cabin walls. But in that moment, the world seemed to narrow to 2 figures, a man in a broken chair and a dog with a broken body locked in a silent standoff. Neither of them wanted, but both somehow needed. Michael's chest rose and fell ragged. His jaw clenched. His hand hovered over the door, ready to slam it shut. But he didn't. The silence stretched, and then the wind shifted, pushing the snow sideways in a violent gust. The door rattled against his grip. His strength faltered. The dog didn't flinch. It simply waited steady as stone. Michael cursed under his breath. With a slow exhale, he pulled the door wider. The Malinois took a single step forward. Inside the cabin, the lamplight caught the scar along its flank. The tag still hanging from a torn collar, half buried in matted fur. Letters worn, but legible Bean. Michael stared. A name. This wasn't a stray. This was something else. Someone else. Bean lowered his head slightly, not submission, but acknowledgement, as if to say, "You opened the door." That's enough. Michael's throat burned. He had spent a decade shutting doors, locking them, closing himself away. And now here was this animal refusing to be shut out. The weight of that realization pressed on him like the storm pressing on the roof. He didn't know why, but he couldn't push the dog back. Bean stepped inside, slow and deliberate, leaving the storm behind. Snow melted on the wooden floor beneath him. He crossed the cabin as though he had always belonged there, then lowered himself at Michael's side. For a long time, neither moved. Neither spoke. Neither asked anything of the other. Just silence. 2 soldiers broken, but not alone anymore. Michael sat there, hands trembling. Eyes locked on the animal at his side. His breath steadied. The storm raged outside, but inside, for the first time in a long while, there was stillness. The weight of it pressed against him, until finally he let his hand fall. It brushed Bean's fur, rough and warm, beneath his fingers. The contact jolted something deep in him, something he had buried beneath years of silence. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, he remembered what it felt like not to be dead. The storm howled, but neither man nor dog moved. They didn't need to. The connection was enough. The night stretched on heavy with snow and silence. But inside the cabin, a new war had begun, the war against the void. And for the first time in 12 years, Michael didn't feel like he was fighting it alone. The night had no mercy. Outside, the storm gnawed at the mountain ridge, hurling snow and ice against the wooden cabin like a relentless beast. Inside, silence pressed down heavy. Michael Harris sat in his wheelchair near the dim window bottle in hand, staring at nothing. His breath fogged faintly in the air. The old heater had been stuttering all day, barely alive. The house smelled of damp wood-stale liquor and defeat. But what he didn't hear, what he couldn't know, was the faint hiss building behind the walls. A single wire, old and frayed, sparked inside the insulation. It danced unseen, snapping like a rattlesnake. For hours it had gnawed at the dry timber until finally fire bit into the heart of the cabin. At first it was a whisper, just a curl of smoke sliding along the ceiling, easy to mistake for the draft of the storm. But then it grew teeth. The light flickered. Michael frowned, setting the bottle down. The lamps dimmed to a sickly orange glow before flaring bright, then dying completely. The storm outside groaned louder, as if conspiring with the darkness. He turned the wheelchair, muttering under his breath, but before he could reach for the flashlight, a smell hit him. Sharp, unmistakable primal. Burning wood. His gut clenched. No. The smoke thickened in seconds, gray ribbons curling downward like grasping fingers. He pushed his chair toward the door, but the wheels snagged against the uneven rug. Panic surged. He yanked, cursed, shoved forward, but the smoke was already choking him, clawing down his throat. Somewhere behind the walls, the fire roared awake, consuming hungry. Michael's hands trembled on the wheels. His chest tightened. He'd been in firefights, ambushes, hell itself. But this was different. This was helplessness made flesh. The house around him hissed like a living thing. The wooden beams popped with gunshot cracks as fire licked higher. Heat pressed against him, oppressive olive. His vision blurred. His lungs screamed. This was how it would end, alone in a blaze, nameless and forgotten. Then came the sound. A frantic, scratching claws tearing against the door. A low bark that cut through the roar of the flames. Bean. Michael coughed, eyes watering, barely able to see. He wanted to shout to tell the dog to run to save itself, but no sound left his throat. The door splintered as the Malinois forced his way through smoke swirling around him. His coat gleamed in the red light, his eyes reflecting fire, two burning coals in the chaos. Bean didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, teeth snapping onto the strap of Michael's chair. Michael gripped the armrests, stunned. "No, you can't," he rasped, but Bean tugged, muscles straining. The chair jerked forward, wheels grinding across the floor. Bean snarled, pulling with the ferocity of a soldier who'd refused to leave a comrade behind. The fire exploded above them, a ceiling beam collapsing, showering sparks. Michael raised his arm to shield his face. Time fractured. Each breath was a war. Each second dragged like a lifetime. He felt the heat blister his skin, smelled his own hair singeing. Death was a heartbeat away. But Bean pulled relentless, dragging him across the room, out of the path of falling timbers toward the faint outline of the open door. Smoke clawed at Michael's vision. He was slipping into darkness when cold air hit his face. The night storm wrapped around him like a brutal savior, snowflakes stinging his skin. Bean gave one final yank and toppled him and the chair out onto the porch, away from the inferno. Michael collapsed, coughing violently, every muscle shuddering with exhaustion. He lay sprawled in the snow, watching flames devour the cabin. The place he'd wasted 10 years in. The place that had been coffin and sanctuary. Now nothing but a pyre. Bean stood over him, chest heaving, ears pinned against the shriek of the fire. His fur was singed along the edges, patches darkened with soot. But his eyes, those soldiers' eyes, never wavered. He pressed his body against Michael's side, grounding him, forcing him to feel something beyond despair. Michael choked out a laugh that sounded like a sob. "You stupid, brave bastard." For the first time in years, he didn't see himself as the forgotten cripple the man left behind. He saw himself in being the survivor, the one who refused to die when death came knocking, the one dragged out of hell by sheer stubborn will. The fire raged louder, swallowing beams collapsing the roof. Sparks shot into the night sky, mingling with the snow like stars being born from destruction. Michael stared transfixed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. That house had been his prison, And now it was gone. The flames took his ghosts, his shame, his self-imposed exile. All that remained was him, a broken soldier on the frozen ground, and the dog who had refused to let him quit. He reached out his hand, trembling, and touched Bean's neck. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move, just leaned into the touch, steady, solid, alive. Michael closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something sharp cut through the numbness. Not just fear, not just pain, but gratitude. A spark. Bean had saved his life. More than that, he had given him a second one. The snow fell heavier, blanketing the wreckage, muffling the crackle of the flames. The world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. Michael's chest ached, his body trembling from shock, but he didn't let go of that fur beneath his hand. He clung to it, to the warmth, to the reality that he wasn't dead. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside, under layers of grief and bitterness, a thought stirred. Maybe he wasn't meant to die tonight. Maybe this storm, this fire, this dog, it was all a test, a brutal, merciless test. And Bean had chosen for him. Pulled him through when he couldn't do it himself. He coughed again, voice hoarse. Guess we're both still here. Bean licked the soot from his face. Just once. A soldier's acknowledgement. Then he lay beside Michael, pressing close against the cold. The two of them, two warriors, burned and scarred, abandoned by the world, sat in the snow watching the fire consume the past. And in that glow, for the first time in a decade, Michael felt a pulse of something he thought was gone forever. Hope. The forest was silent in that uneasy way that made every soldier's skin crawl. No insects, no birds, nothing but the breath of the wind sighing through the skeletal trees. Snow lay heavy over everything, draped across branches like shrouds. Michael wheeled himself down the narrow trail, each push of the rims echoing too loud, too exposed. His breath came in hard, uneven bursts. He shouldn't have been out here, not with his lungs still raw from smoke and his body battered from the fire. But something in him had snapped the night his cabin burned. The flames hadn't just taken wood and walls. They had burned through the last of his excuses. He told himself he was just scouting the land, just testing how far he could go with the chair before he needed to turn back. But the truth pulsed underneath every shove of the wheels. He was running. Not from the forest, not from the snow. From the ghosts clawing at his chest, the wood's blurred tree trunks warping into shadows. His heart kicked harder, thundering against his ribs. Sweat slicked his palms despite the freezing air. He smelled it then, acrid, metallic, thick. Gunpowder. Blood. Sand dusting his tongue. And suddenly the snow wasn't snow anymore. It was grit choking his throat, burning his eyes. He was back in the desert, back in the ambush. Contact right? The voice thundered in his skull, a brother in arms already lost. Bullets snapped past his ear, each crack louder than the last. His arms flailed for his rifle, but the chair trapped him. No, not a chair. A Humvee flipped, twisted. He was pinned, his legs crushed. His breath hitched. He couldn't move, couldn't fight. The air was fire and dust. Screams ripped through the haze, screams he had never silenced, screams that lived with him every night. Michael's vision tunneled. His chest seized. He shoved the wheels too hard. The chair lurched, and before he could steady it, one wheel slid over the edge of the frozen path. The world tilted. He fell. The impact rattled every bone. His back slammed against the ground, air punched from his lungs. Snow exploded around him, swallowing his body in white silence. His wheelchair tumbled aside, half buried against a log. He lay there gasping, eyes wide, the forest spinning above him. His hands clawed at the snow, searching for purchase, but his arms trembled useless. He wasn't in Montana anymore. He was back in hell, and hell had no mercy. Then came the bark, sharp, commanding, real. Bean's voice tore through the nightmare. The Malinois skidded to a halt beside him, fur bristling, ears alert. He barked again, louder this time, as if to snap Michael back to the present. His body pressed against Michael's arm, warm, solid, alive. Michael's shaking hand fumbled through the snow, clinging to that anchor. He gripped fur, felt muscle twitch under his palm. Real. Not sand, not fire. Fur, breath, life. But the panic wasn't done with him. His vision stuttered between two worlds, the forest and the battlefield. He saw enemies slipping between the trees. He smelled smoke that wasn't there. His throat closed, his body convulsed, mind shrieking that he was trapped again, that no one was coming. Bean didn't flinch. He barked, then turned pacing in a tight circle. He barked again, this time toward the tree-lined voice slicing the quiet like a flare. He was calling, not just to Michael, to the world. Michael tried to form words, tried to stop him. His lips cracked around the attempt. Don't waste it. Nobody's coming. But Bean ignored him. He barked again, deeper, more insistent, every sound a demand, hear us. His paws dug furrows in the snow as he sprinted a few feet down the path, then back circling, always returning to press against Michael. His eyes blazed with purpose. He had chosen. He wasn't letting this man die here. Minutes dragged into eternity. Michael's breaths came ragged, torn between sobs and gasps. He tried to push himself up, arms shaking violently, but the forest tilted again and dumped him back into the snow. His palms bled from the ice crust. Helplessness gnawed at him, savage familiar. This was the curse, always needing someone else to pull him from the wreckage. Always the one left broken. His chest ached with rage at himself, rage that this dog believed more in him than he did. Then faint at first came voices. Human. Real. The crunch of boots over snow. A woman's shout carried through the trees. Over here, I hear a dog. Michael's eyes flew open. His breath hitched, torn between disbelief and raw need. Bean barked again, his voice booming across the woods, guiding them. The dog darted forward, tail stiff, barking and retreating, pulling the sound closer until figures emerged through the curtain of white. Two hikers' faces, flushed scarves iced over, rushed toward the sound. Oh my God, the woman gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. He's hurt. No, wait. Are you sir? Can you hear me? Michael's throat scraped raw. Words scraped out like gravel. Chair. Over there. The man scrambled to right the wheelchair, dragging it from the snowbank. Bean stayed planted beside Michael, teeth bared, not aggressive, but commanding. Don't touch him, wrong. Don't you dare. His growl rumbled until Michael's trembling hand brushed his fur again, signaling it was okay. Only then did Beanie's eyes still locked on the strangers. Together, the hikers lifted Michael back into his chair. His body sagged, drained lungs rattling. Bean never left his side, pressing close, refusing to move until Michael was upright again. Your dog saved you, the woman whispered, stroking Bean's flank cautiously. We'd never have found you if he hadn't. Michael's eyes burned, not from smoke this time, but from something deeper. He looked at Bean, truly looked. At the singed fur, the weary posture, the eyes that had seen too much but never wavered. He realized then this wasn't about survival anymore. Bean wasn't just saving his life. He was dragging him back into it, forcing him to face the world, to reach for help, to admit he still mattered. The hikers insisted on walking him back toward town. Bean trotted beside the chair, head high, ears alert every step a guard's march. Michael's hands clenched the wheels, but his eyes never left the dog. The image seared into him, not the fire, not the fall, not the battlefield. Just Bean, the soldier who refused to let him fade. That night, lying on a borrowed cot at the hiker's cabin, Michael stared at the ceiling beams, his chest still rattling with aftershocks. Sleep clawed at him, but so did fear of the nightmares waiting. Yet when Bean curled against his side, warmth bleeding into him, something shifted. His heartbeat slowed, steadying against the dog's rhythm. And when his eyes finally closed, he knew he wasn't alone in the fight anymore. Bean wasn't just his rescuer. He was the tether pulling him out of the pit, inch by inch, breath by breath. And maybe, just maybe, Michael could let himself believe in life again. The knock came like a hammer against the cabin door. Sharp. Uncompromising. Michael flinched at the sound, his hands tightening on the armrests of the wheelchair. Bean lifted his head from where he lay, ears flicking forward, muscles taut under his coat. Another knock, louder, faster, almost a demand. Michael's pulse quickened. No one ever came here unannounced. Easy, he whispered to the dog, though his voice shook. He wheeled closer, every creak of the chair magnified in the silence. His breath ghosted in the cold air that seeped through the cracks. He opened the door, and the world stopped. On the porch, framed by the pale wash of snowlight, stood a girl. 16 maybe, but with a sharpness in her eyes that no teenager should carry. Her hair was tangled, streaked with frost. Her coat hung open, careless against the cold. The anger on her face burned hotter than any winter wind. Michael's heart stuttered. Emily. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, eyes scanning, dissecting, judging. When she finally spoke, her voice cut like glass. So it's true. You are still alive. He tried to breathe, tried to form words, but his chest clamped tight. He hadn't seen her in years, not since she was a child clutching a stuffed bear tighter than she ever clutched him. Now she was taller, older, unrecognizable, yet unmistakable. His daughter. His blood. Emily, don't. She shoved past him before he could finish stomping snow from her boots onto the floor. Bean rose, circling, sniffing confused by the sudden invasion. Emily barely glanced at the dog before throwing her backpack to the ground. You don't get to say my name like that. Not after you walked out. Michael's throat tightened. He turned the chair, watching her pace the cabin as though claiming territory. Her hands shoved deep in her pockets, shoulders hunched every step, radiating defiance. I didn't, he started, but the words felt useless. She spun on him. Don't lie. Mom cried herself to sleep for months. Do you know what that does to a kid? Watching her break while you, what hit out here with a dog? Her voice cracked, but the fury held. Michael flinched as if each word were a bullet. Bean slipped between them, head turning from one to the other, tail stiff. The dog nudged Michael's knee, then stepped toward Emily, sniffing cautiously. Emily folded her arms, glaring down. What? You got a replacement family, a mutt who doesn't care that you disappeared? The words sliced deeper than she knew. Michael leaned forward, gripping the armrests until his knuckles whitened. You think I wanted this? You think I didn't fight? Fight, Emily snapped. You didn't fight for us. You didn't fight for me. The room throbbed with a silence after that. Only the sound of Bean's nails, clicking softly on the wood, filled the gap. Michael lowered his gaze, shame flooding him. How could he explain the nights soaked in morphine, the days swallowed by guilt, the fire that nearly ended him? How could he tell her he stayed away, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much to let her see what he had become? I was broken, he whispered finally, voice raw. Emily's laugh was bitter hollow, so were we. Bean pressed his body against Michael's leg, grounding him. The dog's eyes flicked toward Emily, studying her, weighing her storm. Then Bean patted over nose, brushing her hand. Emily stiffened. She didn't push him away, but she didn't yield either. Her jaw clenched. What's his name? Bean, Michael said quietly. He saved my life. Emily's gaze dropped unwillingly to the dog. Bean sat at her feet, steady, calm gaze, unwavering. Something in his stillness unsettled her. She shoved her hands deeper into her pockets, eyes glistening. Figures. Someone had to. Michael swallowed hard. The room felt too small, the air too thin. He wanted to reach for her to bridge the years with a touch, but his hand stayed anchored to the chair. His daughter stood inches away, and yet she was farther than ever. Bean nudged her again, soft but insistent. This time she looked down longer, her anger colliding with confusion. She crouched slowly, as if testing her own resolve, and let her fingers brush his fur. Warmth bled into her hand, steady, unjudging. For the first time since stepping inside, her voice softened, barely audible. You're not what I expected. Michael watched, hard, aching. Neither am I. Her eyes flicked up sharp again, but something in them trembled. She rose abruptly, pacing toward the window. Don't think this changes anything. I didn't come here for some happy reunion. I needed to see it for myself. To see the man who left us. I didn't leave you, Michael said, desperation leaking through. I left the war. But the war followed me. I couldn't bring that into your life. Emily's hand pressed to the glass palm, flat against the cold. You already did. Bean walked back to Michael, resting his head on the man's lap. His eyes seemed to plead, say what you mean. Stop hiding. Michael's chest heaved. For years he had drowned in silence, convinced words would only poison what little remained. But now silence was the wound itself. He looked at his daughter, at the brittle armor she wore, and felt something crack inside him. I wanted to come back, he said, voice trembling. Every day I wanted to. But I thought you'd be better without me. I thought I'd only ruin you the way I ruined myself. Emily turned her face, flushed wet at the corners of her eyes. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to choose to disappear and then act like it was mercy. You're my dad. You were supposed to be there no matter how broken you were. Michael bowed his head, tears stinging his vision. He had no defense, no weapon against the truth. Bean shifted again, padding over to Emily, nudging her thigh with his nose. She looked down, startled by the insistence. He whined softly, a sound that slipped past her anger and dug into the raw ache beneath. Against her will, her hand found his head again. Her fingers curled into his fur. The fight in her voice cracked. I hated you, she whispered. I told myself I didn't need you, but it never stopped hurting. Michael lifted his gaze, pain etched deep. I know, and I hate myself for every day you felt that way. The cabin held them both, father and daughter, broken edges colliding but not shattering completely. Between them, Bean lay down, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The silence wasn't peace, not yet. But it wasn't war either. It was something fragile, something waiting. Emily wiped her cheek roughly, as if denying the tear. She grabbed her backpack, slinging it over her shoulder. I'm not staying, she muttered. Michael's chest clenched. He wanted to beg to plead, but he knew force would only drive her further. I'll be here, he said instead. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Bean lifted his head, watching her tail tapping once against the floor. Emily glanced back, not at Michael, but at the dog. Their eyes met. She whispered so softly, Michael almost missed it. Take care of him. And then she was gone, swallowed by the storm outside. The door clicked shut, leaving Michael staring at the space she had occupied. His heart was a battlefield torn between despair and a flicker of hope. Bean rose, walked over, and pressed his head into Michael's chest. Michael's arms wrapped around the dog, holding on, as if to anchor himself against the void. His voice broke into the fur. She came. She actually came. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, a new crack had opened, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that lets light through. The snow had not stopped falling for days, and the cabin at the edge of the Colorado woods looked like a forgotten outpost, swallowed by white silence. Inside, Michael Harris sat in his wheelchair, half shrouded in shadow, staring at the wall as if it had answers that never came. Across from him, Bean rested on the floor with the stillness of a soldier at guard. And now there was another presence. Emily, his daughter, 16 years old with fire in her voice and hurt in her eyes. For Michael, the weight of her sudden reappearance was almost unbearable. The silence between them was a battlefield. Every word he wanted to say felt like shrapnel stuck in his throat. He could feel her glances slicing at him, each one asking a question he had no courage to answer. Where were you when I needed you? Emily avoided him, throwing herself instead toward Bean. It was the dog that seemed to receive her confessions, her laughter, even her rage. Michael would watch her kneel in the snow, brushing Bean's fur, whispering things he couldn't hear. The sight of it hurt, but it also kept him alive, because for the first time in years, his daughter was close enough for him to see again. Bean adapted to Emily with uncanny precision. The Malinois would mirror her movements, respond to her sharp whistles, and when she ran into the woods, he followed at her side like a loyal shadow. Michael could only watch from the doorway wheels of his chair buried in the frozen ground, remembering the days when his own comrades had trusted him with the same silent loyalty. He recognized something in Bean's discipline, the rigid stillness, the focus in his amber eyes when he received commands. It was the ghost of his own past staring back at him. And then there was Emily, her laughter quick and sharp, when Bean obeyed, her arms wrapping around the dog's neck like she was holding on to the only steady thing in her collapsing world. Michael saw her not as a rebellious teenager in ripped jeans, but as the child he once carried on his shoulders, her small fingers tugging at his hair. Yet every time he tried to speak, the air shattered with tension. He would start with her name, Emily, but the rest would choke in his chest. She would glare, eyes burning, then turn her face away, stroking Bean as if to remind him she had found someone else to listen. One evening, when the storm pressed against the cabin and the fire cracked like rifle shots, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor with Bean's head in her lap. Michael, a silent observer, caught fragments of her voice. She spoke about school fights, about being tired of her mother's rules, about running away, just to breathe. Michael felt those words strike him harder than any bullet he had ever taken. She was searching for belonging the same way he had been, except her war wasn't fought on foreign soil. It was fought in the emptiness he had left behind. Bean's ears twitched as if he understood every syllable. He lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against her chin, and Emily broke into tears she thought no one saw. But Michael saw. He gripped the armrest of his wheelchair, nails digging in, wanting to reach her to say something, anything that could close the canyon between them. Instead, he sat frozen, heart pounding like a trapped drum. In the days that followed, the fragile rhythm of this new trio formed. Mornings carried the sound of Emily's laughter outside as she practiced commands with Bean. Sit, stay, go. The dog obeyed with precision, circling her like a protective force. Michael would watch from the porch, his blanket draped over his shoulders, breath clouding in the cold air. Each command echoed in his chest, stirring memories of giving orders to his own team men who had trusted him with their lives. At night, he would catch Emily leaning against Bean, whispering into the silence, while the dog's tail thumped softly. Sometimes she fell asleep like that, curled beside the animal, as if Bean were a shield against the world. Michael would find himself staring at them, envy and gratitude clashing inside him. Bean had built a bridge he himself had failed to lay down. But bridges, however fragile, still mattered. One afternoon, Emily was training Bean to fetch a stick in the snow. She threw it farther than intended into the trees, and he sprinted off. Minutes passed. Then he returned, not with the stick, but with something else, an old army patch torn and dirt-stained, likely buried under the snow for years. Bean dropped it at Emily's feet. She picked it up, puzzled, brushing away ice. Michael recognized it instantly. It was his. From Iraq. From the day everything changed. His breath hitched his body rigid as Emily turned to him, holding it between her fingers. Their eyes met, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was no anger in hers. Only questions. He couldn't find words. His throat was dry, the silence aching. But Emily didn't push. She simply tucked the patch into her jacket pocket and went back to Bean, throwing him another stick. Michael felt something shift inside him, like the first crack of light under a closed door. The days bled into each other. Michael found himself moving closer, rolling his chair outside when Emily played with Bean, asking simple questions. Did he listen today, or what did you teach him? Her replies were curt-clipped, but she answered. Each word she gave was a lifeline, and he clutched them greedily. At night, while Emily slept, Michael leaned forward in his chair, watching Bean at the foot of her mattress. The dog's eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, alert even in stillness. Michael whispered into the dark, knowing Bean was the only one listening. Don't let me fail her again. The bond that was forming between girl father and dog was fragile, trembling like glass in a storm. Yet beneath it ran something undeniable hope. Bean had become the quiet messenger carrying Michael's unspoken love to Emily and carrying Emily's pain back to him. And in those fleeting moments, when Emily's laughter echoed in the cabin again, Michael let himself believe just for a second that maybe against every odd, the three of them could learn how to be a family. The knock on the cabin door came like a gunshot in the stillness of the evening. Michael Harris froze. Emily had been laughing with Bean only moments earlier, her voice bouncing against the wooden walls, but now the sound evaporated, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on every nerve in his body. Bean's ears pricked. His body stiffened, low growl vibrating through his chest. Michael's hand hovered over the pistol on his lap. He had never told Emily he kept one close, hidden beneath the blanket draped across his wheelchair. Old instincts never died, and something in Bean's sudden change of posture told him this was not a friendly visitor. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps deliberate. A soldier's rhythm. Michael's pulse spiked. He rolled himself toward the door, motioning Emily back. "Stay behind me," he whispered, voice tight with command. She bristled at his tone, but obeyed, clutching Bean's collar as if she sensed the storm about to break. Michael opened the door. 3 men stood outside, shadows cut sharp against the snow-dusted pines. Their faces were older, worn with years, but he knew them instantly. Ramirez, Cole, and Daniels. Ghosts from another life. The desert heat, the choking sandstorms, the endless missions, they rushed back at once, flooding his chest with a weight he thought he'd buried. Mike Ramirez said, his voice low, steady, almost friendly. "Long time." Michael's grip tightened on the doorframe. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ramirez's eyes flicked past him, into the cabin, landing on Bean. The Malinois stood rigid, hackles up, teeth bared. Recognition flashed across Ramirez's face. "So it's true," he murmured. "You still have him?" Emily looked between them, confused. "Dad, what's going on?" Michael ignored her, his jaw locked. "You need to leave." But Cole stepped forward, his boots crunching the snow. "We can't leave without the dog." His voice carried an edge, the kind of edge honed by years of carrying out orders you could never admit existed. Michael's heart thudded. He had prayed this day would never come. Bean had not just been a rescue. He had been a weapon. Years ago, during a mission codenamed Phantom Wolf, Bean was part of an experimental K9 unit designed for extreme reconnaissance dogs, trained not only for combat, but for intelligence gathering, fitted with classified tech that made them more than animals, more than soldiers. Bean had survived when most hadn't. And in surviving, he had carried secrets men like Ramirez and Cole could never let walk free. Michael steadied his voice, though every nerve screamed. "He's mine now. He's out. You're not taking him." Ramirez sighed as if he had expected this answer. You don't understand, Mike. That dog has memories, imprints, data. Things that were never meant to see the light of day. We don't want trouble, but if Bean falls into the wrong hands, everything we bled for goes to hell. Emily's voice cut in sharp with panic. He's just a dog. Cole's gaze snapped to her, cold and unblinking. He's not just a dog, kid. He's a liability. Bean snarled, the sound deep and guttural, pushing forward, as if he understood every threat in Cole's tone. Michael's hand hovered near his pistol, but he knew drawing it now would ignite a war he couldn't win. 3 against 1 with Emily caught in the middle. Daniel, silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was gravel. We'll make it simple. Hand him over. No one gets hurt. You can walk away with your kid and keep playing house in the woods. Or you keep him and you paint a target on all of you. The words sliced through the room. Michael's breath hitched. He looked at Emily, at the fear blooming in her eyes. This was the cost of his past, bleeding into his present. He turned back to Ramirez, anger sharp in his chest. Do you hear yourself? You're talking about putting down a soldier who saved lives. He's more human than half the men I knew in those deserts. Ramirez's expression softened for half a second, as if part of him agreed. But then the soldier in him hardened again. Orders are orders. Phantom Wolf never ended. You know that. The cabin was suffocating with silence. Michael's mind raced. If he gave Bean up, Emily would hate him forever. He would betray the one being who had dragged him out of his nightmares. But if he resisted, he risked dragging his daughter into a shadow war she could never understand. Bean stepped closer to Michael's chair, pressing against his leg, as if making his own choice. His amber eyes were unwavering, locked on the men at the door. Loyal, defiant. Michael's throat ached with unspoken words. He remembered nights in the desert, Bean by his side, alert to every movement. The time the dog pulled him from a burning Humvee. The time he stood guard while Michael bled. Every scar on Michael's body had Bean's shadow imprinted beside it. He couldn't give him up. Get off my property, Michael said, his voice low, iron steady. You're not taking him. The air went colder. Cole's hand drifted to the rifle slung over his shoulder. Emily sucked in a breath, clutching Bean tighter. Ramirez raised a hand, stopping Cole. His eyes drilled into Michael's. Think hard, Mike. This isn't about you. This isn't even about him. It's about everything that comes crashing down if Phantom Wolf leaks. You've got a daughter to think about now. Don't be a fool. Michael's jaw trembled. He had thought himself a broken man, a father who had already lost too much. But now, faced with these ghosts demanding his last tether to life, he felt a fire he hadn't felt in years. I am thinking about my daughter, he said. And I'm not handing over the only thing standing between her and the darkness I left behind. The 3 men stared at him. Ramirez's face was unreadable, Cole's brimming with fury, Daniel's with cold calculation. The storm outside howled against the windows, echoing the storm inside the cabin. Finally, Ramirez spoke. We'll give you time to reconsider. But understand this, we're not the only ones looking. If we don't take him, someone else will. And they won't ask politely. He stepped back into the snow. The others followed, disappearing into the tree line, like predators retreating into the night, leaving only the weight of their warning behind. Michael shut the door, hands shaking. Emily turned on him, voice trembling with rage and fear. What the hell was that? Who are they? What does Bean have to do with you? Michael's breath caught. The truth clawed at his chest, but the words refused to form. He looked at Bean instead, the silent guardian, the soldier, the secret. I'll explain, he whispered, though he didn't know if he could. But for now, all you need to know is this: he stays with us. No matter what. Emily stared at him, tears threatening to fall. Bean pressed against her legs, steady and unyielding. And for the first time, Michael realized this choice, this refusal to surrender, was not just about a dog. It was about his soul, about proving to himself, to his daughter, and to the ghosts clawing at his door that he would not abandon his family again. The night stretched long and merciless. Outside, the forest swallowed the footsteps of men who once called him brother. Inside, Michael sat in his chair, Bean at his side, Emily glaring at him with questions that could not yet be answered. He had chosen his path. And in that choice, he knew war was coming. The cabin was thick with silence, the kind of silence that makes the hairs on your arms rise before your mind even registers why. Outside, the wind hissed through the pines, their branches scraping like skeletal fingers against the wooden siding. Michael sat awake in his wheelchair by the window, every sense alert because his body, though broken, still carried the instincts of a soldier. Something was wrong. Being stirred before Michael heard it. The Malinois lifted his head ears, slicing through the night muscles taut. A growl rumbled low in his chest. Michael's pulse spiked. He reached for the pistol on the table, the weight of cold steel grounding him as the unease sharpened into certainty. Someone was out there. Dad, Emily's sleepy voice came from the bedroom. "Wise Bean." Quiet Michael snapped softer than a whisper, firm as a command. He wheeled toward her door just as the back window exploded inward with a crash of glass and splintering wood. A figure burst into the cabin, masked, swift, and brutal. Bean lunged with a roar, the air tearing with the violence of his bark. The intruder swung something metallic, striking the dog midair. But Bean twisted teeth flashing, sinking into fabric and flesh. Emily screamed. The masked man grunted, staggering, but he wasn't alone. Another shadow slipped through the broken window. Two of them. Professionals. "Grab the dog," one snarled. Bean fought like fire unleashed, snapping, clawing, his fury filling the cabin. But the second intruder yanked a cord from his belt, looping it around Bean's neck, hauling back with brute force. The Malinois thrashed, choking, but the cord tightened. "Dad?" Emily shrieked, backing toward the wall as the first intruder lunged for her. Michael's heart detonated in his chest. He pushed his wheelchair forward, pistol raised, firing a shot into the ceiling. The crack ripped the night apart. "Let her go." His voice boomed, rage tearing through the years of restraint. The intruders hesitated only for a breath. Then the first man snatched Emily's wrist, jerking her forward. She kicked, screamed, nails clawing at his arm. The second dragged Bean toward the shattered window, the dog clawing for footing, fury, unrelenting even as the cord bit deep into his neck. Michael fired again, aiming low. The bullet chewed the floorboards inches from the man's boot. The intruder cursed, yanking Emily tighter against him like a shield. "Drop it, old man, or she dies." Michael's vision blurred with rage. He saw his daughter's terror-stricken face, Bean's desperate fight, and he felt the helplessness crushing his chest like a vice. The men bolted for the door, dragging Emily and Bean into the night. Michael spun his chair, adrenaline electrifying his body-mind, flashing into old battle mode. He launched himself out of the cabin, the wheels of his chair slicing through dirt and snow as he propelled forward with a force that defied his broken body. The forest swallowed them. Branches lashed at Emily as she struggled, her screams piercing the darkness. Bean's snarls echoed feral and raw. Michael thundered after them, his arms pumping the wheels like pistons. He knew this terrain. He had chosen this cabin because the forest was both cover and trap. But tonight, it was a battlefield. The intruders moved fast, shadows cutting through the trees. Michael pushed harder, chest-burning eyes locked on his daughter's pale outline in the dark. "Emily," he roared. "Dad." Her cry split the night, laced with fear, with faith. Bean surged, suddenly wrenching against the cord with a violent twist. His teeth sank into the wrist of the man holding him, blood spraying. The attacker screamed, stumbling. Bean tore free, hurling himself at the man, dragging Emily. He hit like a missile, jaws clamping into the intruder's shoulder, ripping him back. Emily fell to the ground, scrambling away. The first man cursed, raising a knife. "I'll gut you." "Bean," Emily screamed as steel slashed down. Michael saw it all through a haze of fire. His chair struck a root, jolting violently, throwing him forward. He crashed into the earth pane, detonating in his ribs. The wheelchair toppled behind him, but rage burned hotter than pain. He clawed toward the fallen crutch strapped to the side of the chair, fingers trembling. He grabbed it, forcing himself upright onto one knee. His legs shook, screaming with weakness, with memory of wounds that had ruined him. But he planted the crutch beneath his arm, pushing, groaning through clenched teeth, until for the first time in years, he was standing. Emily's scream echoed again, Michael's eyes locked on a heavy branch lying near his boots. He seized it with his free hand, raised it high, and with every ounce of strength in his battered body, hurled it into the fray. The branch cracked against the knife wielder's forearm with a sickening thud. The blade flew into the dirt. Bean seized the opening, tearing into the man's throat with a savage, merciless fury. Emily crawled toward Michael, sobbing, clinging to him as he steadied himself against the crutch. His chest heaved, every breath fire, every muscle screaming. The second intruder lunged again, but Bean was faster, bloodied muzzle snapping, dragging the man down into the mud with sheer ferocity. Michael raised his pistol arm, trembling, sight-locked. "Get the hell away from my family." The shot cracked. The intruder dropped. For a moment, the world stilled. The forest breathed again. Snow fell softly through the broken canopy above, indifferent to the carnage below. Michael staggered his crutch, sinking into the soil. But he remained upright, his daughter pressed to his chest, Bean circling them like a bloodied guardian angel. Emily looked up at him, eyes wide with awe and terror. "Dad, you stood up." Michael's throat closed. He looked down at her, at Bean, at the wreckage of violence around them. He had stood not for himself, but because he had no other choice. Because his family had needed him. But the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning. He tightened his grip on the crutch, fire raging in his eyes. "We move. Now. More will come." And with Bean leading Emily at his side, and the forest trembling with shadows of pursuit, Michael stepped forward into the night, no longer bound to the chair that had held him, but bound instead to the war that had found him again. The forest had gone quiet again, though not with the peaceful quiet of earlier nights. It was a silence heavy with aftermath, broken branches, scorched breath, and the ragged sound of survival. The snow had swallowed the sounds of struggle almost instantly, leaving only the steam rising from blood in the cold air and the faint crunch of Michael's crutch as he staggered forward. Then his body gave way. One moment he was upright, defiant, a soldier reborn in the chaos. The next his knees buckled and the weight of battle crashed down on him all at once. His crutch slipped on the frozen earth, his body collapsed, and he landed hard in the snow with a guttural groan. "Dad?" Emily's voice cracked as she dropped beside him, her small hands grabbing his shoulders. "Dad?" Michael's breath tore in and out of his lungs, shallow, jagged. His body trembled violently, his chest heaving as though his heart had sprinted beyond his strength. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook uselessly, every nerve screaming betrayal. His forehead pressed into the cold ground, snow melting into his hair. "I can't," he rasped. The words came like broken glass. His pride split open. His voice was not the iron of a commander, but the rasp of a man drowning in his own failure. "I can't do this anymore. I'm useless." Emily's tears hid his face before her words did. "No, don't say that. Don't you dare say that." She clutched his jacket, shaking him, as though she could shake the despair from him. "You stood up, Dad. You fought for me. You fought for Bean." "That's not useless. That's everything." But Michael only shook his head, the despair eating at him faster than the pain. His body was broken, his spirit drained, and for a moment the shadows of the forest seemed to lean closer, whispering the truth he feared most, that this night had shown his limits, not his strength. "I wasn't fast enough," he whispered, voice cracking. "I wasn't strong enough. You almost died because of me. Bean almost." His words choked, his throat closing against the image of his daughter ripped from him, of Bean bleeding in the snow. "You deserve someone better than this. A father who isn't broken." Emily's sobs spilled out in jagged bursts. She pressed her face into his chest, holding him, as though if she clung tight enough, the pieces of him would fuse back together. Her voice was muffled, but fierce. "I don't want someone else. I don't care if you're broken. I don't care if you can't run like before. I just want you. I just want my dad." Her words carved straight through the fog of shame. Michael felt her small body trembling against his, her heartbeat hammering like a desperate signal. The tears soaking into his shirt weren't from disappointment, they were from love. Pure, aching, relentless love. He lifted one shaking hand, resting it against her back. "Emily?" His voice was a fractured whisper, his chest tight with something deeper than pain. "I don't know how to be the man I was. I can't go back." "I don't want you to go back," she cried, lifting her tear-streaked face to his. Her eyes blazed through the blur of tears. "I don't want a hero. I don't want the soldier. I just want you to come back to me. Not the man from before the father I still have. That's all I've ever wanted." The world stopped for Michael in that moment. The noise in his head, the endless chorus of failure, loss, regret faded under the weight of her plea. She wasn't asking for miracles. She wasn't asking for the legend he had once been. She was asking for presence, for him. And lying there in the snow, battered and gasping, Michael realized he had been measuring himself against the wrong battles. He had been comparing scars to strength, mobility, to worth. But Emily didn't care about any of that. She only cared that he was still hers. Bean stumbled closer. Then his sides heaving, blood smeared along his tan coat. His breath came in deep, ragged pulls, each inhale a battle in itself. Yet his eyes never left Michael and Emily, fierce, unwavering, loyal. He dropped heavily onto the snow beside them, his body curling near theirs, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. The heat radiating off him was feverish, but his gaze was sharp, as if to say, "I'm still here." Emily reached a trembling hand toward Bean, stroking the fur along his neck, her fingers brushing over the bruised line where the cord had strangled him. Her tears spilled anew, dripping onto his muzzle. He stayed, Dad. He didn't stop fighting, even when it hurt. He didn't give up on us. Michael's chest caved under the truth in her words. Bean, bloodied and bruised, had refused surrender. Emily, fragile yet fierce, had refused to let go. And here he was, the man who thought himself useless, being held together by the faith of a child and the loyalty of a dog. His lips trembled, his hand finding Emily's cheek, brushing away the wet streaks of her tears. I thought I had nothing left to give. You have me, she whispered, fiercely gripping his hand. You have Bean. That's enough. That's everything. For the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to weep. Not silent, shamed tears, but deep, guttural sobs that racked his chest and shook his frame. Years of anger, regret, and self-loathing poured out into the snow. And Emily held him through it all, her small arms refusing to let go, while Bean's warm body pressed against his side like a sentinel of flesh and spirit. The storm inside him cracked, then not with the violence of battle, but with the fragile light of surrender. He was broken, yes. But in their eyes, broken didn't mean worthless. Broken meant human. And human was enough. He leaned his forehead against Emily's, their breaths mingling, tears mingling. I'm sorry, he whispered, for everything. For shutting you out, for letting you believe I was gone. You don't have to be sorry, she said softly, her voice frayed but steady. Just be here. That's all I've ever wanted. Just be here. Snow drifted down through the shattered canopy, soft flakes catching in their hair, dissolving into their skin. The world felt suspended, fragile like glass. Michael's strength was gone. His body wrung dry, but in the hollowed-out space left behind, something new had taken root. Not the invincible soldier, not the broken man, just a father who still had a heartbeat, a daughter who still believed in it, and a dog who refused to leave their side. Bean shifted closer, resting his heavy head across Michael's leg, eyes closing with exhaustion, but never with surrender. His loyalty burned brighter than words. Michael's trembling hand found Bean's fur fingers tangling in the thick coat, gripping, as though the animal were the only anchor keeping him from drowning. You saved us, he whispered, his voice breaking. Both of you saved me. Emily's hand joined his, small and soft against the coarse fur. We saved each other. For a long time, they simply stayed like that, in the silence after storm, in the wreckage of violence, in the fragile sanctuary carved from pain and survival. Father, daughter, and dog broken, yet bound tighter than ever before. And in that brokenness, Michael finally understood this was not weakness. This was life. This was love. This was enough. The first light of morning broke over the mountain town gray and muted after the storm. Snow clung to the rooftops of the small hospital, steam curling from vents into the crisp winter air. Inside, the fluorescent hum was almost unbearable to Michael. So different from the silence of the forest, so sterile compared to the raw chaos of survival. He lay on a narrow bed of E-line in his arm, the sting of antiseptic thick in his nostrils. His body felt heavy, every muscle rebelling. He had survived the night, but survival was not victory. It was the beginning of something harder. The doctor, a broad-shouldered woman, with a kind but unyielding gaze, stood at his bedside with a clipboard. Her voice was steady, practical, yet not without compassion. Your injuries aren't new, Michael. What's new is that you pushed them farther than your body has been willing in years. That's why you collapsed. But listen to me, you can recover. Not to the man you were, but to a man who can walk again, who can live again. Michael's eyes darkened. He had heard words like these before, the well-meaning encouragements of physicians who didn't see the ghost behind his eyes. You don't understand, he muttered, voice low. I've tried. The pain doesn't stop. My body doesn't listen anymore. The doctor leaned closer, her tone sharpening. Then, make it listen. Pain isn't the enemy, Michael. Giving up is. You've already proven that you can still fight. Your daughter saw it. Your dog saw it. Don't undo that now. Start the work. Slowly. Daily. Relentlessly. That's the only way forward. Her words landed heavy in the room. Emily sat at the corner of the bed, small hands gripping the edge of the blanket. She had been silent until now, her wide eyes shifting between them. Finally, she spoke, voice trembling but fierce. Please, Dad. Do it for you. Do it for me. We can't go back, but Maybe we can go forward. Michael's throat tightened. Her words struck with more force than the doctor's clinical authority. Forward, not back. For years he had lived in reverse, measuring himself against the ghost of a soldier he could no longer be. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe forward meant something else entirely. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and gave the faintest nod. The days that followed were brutal. Rehabilitation was not the glory of combat or the drama of survival. It was repetition, monotony, sweat soaking into cheap gym mats, hands trembling on metal bars, teeth gritted against a tide of pain that mocked every effort. The first time they asked him to stand between parallel bars, Michael's arms shook so violently he thought they'd snap. His legs screamed, stiff and uncooperative, each nerve a bolt of fire. He collapsed back into the chair, breath ragged shame burning hot across his skin. "I can't," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Yes, you can." Emily shot back from the sideline, her voice sharper than her frame suggested. She was only a child, but in her tone was something older, something carved by nights of fear and mornings of resolve. One more try. Just one. For me. And so he tried again. And again. Each time his body faltered, but each time Emily's small voice anchored him. Bean was never far away. The staff frowned at first, uneasy about a large dog pacing the rehab wing. But Emily had been relentless. "He's part of us," she had said firmly. "We're a team. He stays." Bean settled into the role as though born for it. When Michael strained to pull himself up, Bean pressed close, his head nudging against Michael's leg, his steady weight grounding him. When Michael finally managed 3 trembling steps, Emily clapped and Bean barked once sharp, triumphant, as though declaring victory for them all. The pain did not vanish. It never did. But something began to shift. It was in the way Michael's eyes no longer drifted toward the floor in defeat, but fixed on Emily's determined face. It was in the way Emily carried a notebook everywhere, drawing small stars for every milestone, 2 steps, 5 steps, standing without collapse. It was in the way Bean seemed to anticipate every struggle, adjusting his stance. His eyes locked with Michael's, as if reminding him, "I'm here. You're not alone." The trio became a strange sight in the rehab ward. The broken soldier, the fierce child, and the loyal dog. Patients whispered. Nurses smiled behind clipboards. Even the doctor, who had seen too many lost causes, found herself lingering at the door to watch. But the work was not just physical. It was psychological warfare. Nights were the hardest. When the lights dimmed and silence crept in, Michael's doubts came roaring back. The failures of the day replayed louder than the victories. The pain throbbed more insistently in the dark. His chest tightened with the old enemy fear. On one such night, Emily curled into the chair beside his bed, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She had fallen asleep that way, as though refusing to give his demon space. Bean lay on the floor, one ear twitching at every creak in the hall, eyes half closed, but always alert. Michael studied them in the dim light, his heart twisting. They believed in him so completely, and yet he still doubted himself. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the only way forward was to let their belief carry him until his own belief caught up. The next morning he pushed harder. He bore the fire in his legs longer. When his arms shook, he tightened his jaw instead of letting go. And when the therapist told him to rest, Emily's grin convinced him to take one more step. Weeks passed. Progress was slow, uneven, but undeniable. From 3 steps to 5, from 5 to a dozen. The first time he managed a full lap around the parallel bars, Emily threw her arms around him so fiercely he nearly toppled her laughter, bright and wet with tears. Bean barked again, tail wagging furiously, as if declaring to the whole hospital, "He's back." But Michael knew better. He wasn't back. He was becoming. He began to see it not just in his body, but in Emily. She had grown harder and softer all at once. Fierce in her encouragement, tender in her care. She pushed him sometimes mercilessly, but every push came wrapped in love. She began working with Bean too, teaching him commands, rewarding him with scraps of food she saved from her tray. "We're training together," she told Michael proudly. "So when you're ready, we'll all be ready." Michael watched them one afternoon. Emily kneeling on the mat, Bean obediently sitting, eyes locked on her every move. The sunlight slanted through the window, catching in Emily's hair, casting her face in a glow. For a moment, Michael's throat closed. He saw not just his daughter, but his partner, his teammate. The anchor that had kept him from drowning. The 3 of them weren't just surviving anymore. They were becoming something stronger. A unit. A family reborn in fire and pain. One night, Emily whispered to him as she drifted to sleep, her voice half dream. We're a team now. Not 2, 3. You, me, and Bean. Forever. Michael lay awake long after staring at the ceiling, her words echoing. For the first time in years, he let himself believe them. The road ahead would still be brutal. His body would never be what it once was. The world would never stop testing him. But he was no longer walking it alone. He had Emily's fierce heart, Bean's loyal soul, and a path that led not backward, not into regret, but forward into something new. Into life. The snow had begun to melt when the idea first surfaced, though winter still clung stubbornly to the ridges above the valley. Michael sat at a weathered picnic table outside the hospital, his cane propped against the bench, the crisp air carrying the faint scent of pine. Emily sat across from him, her boots swinging above the frozen ground, Bean stretched at their feet like a sentinel, finally at ease. For weeks, Michael's world had been consumed with therapy pain progress setbacks and small victories. But now, as the thaw hinted at a season of change, something else stirred in him. It wasn't just about his recovery anymore. It was about what came after. Emily had been sketching in her notebook, her tongue caught between her teeth as her pencil scratched furiously. When she finally slid the page across the table, Michael frowned down at the crude drawing. It was a rectangle with a roof, a yard dotted with kennels and stick figures, men, women, children, scattered among dogs of every shape and size. At the top, written in bold, childish letters, were the words, "A place for heroes." Michael blinked. "What's this?" "Our future," Emily said simply. Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of innocence and something far older, forged in hardship. A place where soldiers who got lost like you can find their way back. And dogs, too. Dogs like Bean, who people forget once the fighting's over. We could make it real, Dad. We could help them. The words hit Michael like a blow. He stared at her speechless as her vision unfolded in his mind. A sanctuary for the broken, a refuge for the forgotten. But doubts crowded quickly. He rubbed a hand over his face. "Em, it's a beautiful idea, but dreams like that, they take money, land people. I can barely walk a block without my legs catching fire. How could I possibly build something like this?" Emily leaned forward, stubbornness carved into her young features. "You already did the hardest part, Dad. You stood up when you thought you couldn't. You didn't do it alone. You had me and Bean. Now imagine if others had the same thing. Other kids like me. Other soldiers like you. We can't do everything, but we can start something. Just one step." Her words settled into him, heavy and undeniable. For years, Michael had lived in survival mode, chained to pain and memory. Now Emily was daring him to imagine beyond himself. A future not just for them, but for others. That night, he couldn't sleep. The vision gnawed at him. He pictured the faces of men he'd known, veterans who had slipped into the shadows, haunted and hollow. He thought of the working dogs abandoned, when their usefulness ended, their loyalty repaid with neglect. He thought of children lost and bruised by circumstances they didn't deserve, desperate for stability. Could a place exist where all of them, soldier, dog, child, might heal together? By morning, Michael's decision was made. The first step was words. Over breakfast, he leaned across the table and said quietly, "We'll try. But if we're doing this, Emily, we do it together. No turning back." Emily's grin nearly split her face. Together. Always. From that moment, their lives took a new trajectory. At first, it was only talk sketches on napkins, long walks through town, as Michael scouted abandoned lots. Questions whispered to townsfolk about property and permits. But the idea spread quicker than either expected. The town, still small and close-knit, remembered Michael not as the broken veteran who had withdrawn, but as the man who had come back from the storm alive and standing with his daughter at his side and a dog that had saved them both. His resilience had become a quiet legend, and now when he spoke of creating a refuge, people listened. One by one, allies appeared. A retired carpenter named Harold, once a Marine, offered to donate his labor. "These hands aren't what they used to be, but I can raise a roof. For brothers like us, I'll do it for free." A young woman named Clara, who ran the town's modest library, volunteered to handle paperwork and grant applications. "You'll need funding," she said firmly, pushing her glasses up her nose. "There are programs for veterans and rescue animals. I'll dig them up. Just promise you won't give up halfway." Even the mayor, usually cautious with town resources, gave a nod of approval. "This community needs hope. You've given us a reason to believe again, Michael. You'll have our support." And then there were the children. At first they came out of curiosity, boys and girls with restless energy, the kind who often ended up in trouble. They lingered at the edges when Michael and Emily cleared brush from the old Miller farm where the sanctuary was to take root. Bean bounded among them, tail wagging, breaking down walls quicker than words ever could. Before long, the children were carrying planks, hammering nails, laughing as they smeared paint across each other's faces. Michael watched them work, his chest tightening. These were the kids who had nowhere to go after school, who wandered alleys or slipped into fights. Here, under Emily's fearless leadership, they found purpose. She taught them small tasks, measuring boards, mixing concrete, and their eyes lit with pride. It was not just a project. It was a fire spreading through the community, warming corners that had long been cold. But the journey was far from easy. There were days Michael's body betrayed him, when the pain in his legs flared so sharply he nearly collapsed. On those days, he wanted to retreat to let others carry the burden. But Emily never let him. She shoved the cane back into his hand, set her jaw, and said, "Dreams don't wait, Dad. Neither do we." There were nights when grant applications were denied, when bank accounts thinned, when cynics in town muttered that it would all collapse by winter. Michael lay awake, the weight of failure pressing heavy. But then he would hear Emily's steady breathing beside him, see Bean's silent vigil at the foot of the bed, and something inside him refused to surrender. Slowly, structures began to rise. The first kennel, small and humble, stood like a beacon. When they brought in the first abandoned dog, a limping German shepherd named Duke, Emily wept openly as Bean sniffed him, tail wagging, before curling beside him in the straw. "See," she whispered to Michael, "this is what we're meant to do." Then came the first veteran. His name was Carl, a wiry man with sunken eyes and hands that trembled. He had been living in his truck alone and adrift. Michael welcomed him with a firm handshake. No pity, only recognition. "You're home," Michael told him simply. And for the first time in years, Carl's shoulders eased. Word spread. What began as a sketch in a child's notebook became a movement. The atmosphere shifted in the town itself. Where once the streets felt muted, cautious, weighed down by long winters and longer silences, now laughter drifted from the construction site. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years worked side by side. Veterans found themselves telling stories they had buried, not to drown in sorrow, but to forge bonds again. Children once lost in anger now found themselves responsible for living creatures who needed them. Hope had taken root. Michael felt it most one evening as the sun set behind the ridges. The sanctuary was still rough, unfinished fences, paint half-dry, supplies scattered. But the yard was alive with motion, children tossing balls to dogs, veterans leaning on canes and shoulders, but smiling Emily running through it all with her notebook clutched to her chest. Bean barked joyfully, weaving between them like the spirit of the place itself. Michael leaned heavily on his cane, his body aching, but his spirit burning. Emily spotted him from across the yard and sprinted over her cheeks, flushed her eyes wide with triumph. "It's working, Dad," she gasped. "They're healing, just like us." He pulled her close, his voice breaking. "No, Emily. They're not healing because of me. They're healing because of you. Because you refused to let me stay broken. Because you believed." In her eyes, he saw the truth. This wasn't just his redemption. It was theirs. A shared dream born from pain, forged in resilience, lit now with the fire of community. The cold of winter had begun to fade, replaced not just by spring, but by something deeper, something more enduring. The sanctuary was no longer just a plan. It was a promise that no one man, child, or dog would ever be left behind again. The night it happened, the air carried the smell of pine smoke long before anyone saw the flames. Michael had been dozing in his chair cane, resting across his lap, when Bean's low growl cut through the silence like a knife. Emily was already halfway to the door, her small frame taut with alarm. By the time Michael reached the porch, he saw at the sanctuary their fragile dream barely born, swallowed by tongues of fire clawing toward the sky. The blaze devoured the wood they had hammered together with trembling hands, the kennels that children had painted in crooked strokes of blue and green. The firelight turned the night savage, and in its flicker, Michael caught movement, shadows darting away, retreating into the darkness. Enemies. The faceless kind who thrived on destruction, who couldn't stand to see hope survive, where despair was supposed to reign. Emily gasped, tears springing to her eyes. The dogs? Michael's heart seized. The sanctuary wasn't empty. Inside those rising walls were Duke the limping shepherd and half a dozen others they had rescued in recent weeks. Innocent lives, terrified and trapped. And in that instant, his body moved before thought could catch him. He snatched his cane, clutched Emily's arm, and shouted, "Stay with me! We're going in!" The heat hit them like a wall. Smoke curled thick and acrid, clawing into Michael's throat. He stumbled forward, every nerve in his damaged legs screaming. But Emily's small hand pulled at him, steadying him, guiding him. Bean surged ahead, barking with furious urgency. The dog lunged against the rising wall of flame as if sheer will might tear it apart. Inside the kennel, the cries of the dogs shredded the night. Whimpers, howls, claws, scratching desperately against wood. They were suffocating in terror, penned in by the inferno. Michael shoved through the haze, coughing violently, until he reached the latch of the first pen. His fingers fumbled, blistered from the searing heat, but the gate finally burst open. Duke bolted out, muzzle blackened with soot, vanishing toward the safety of the yard. Emily Michael's voice rasped, "Get the others!" She was already there, fearless, tugging at a latch almost too hot to touch. Bean lunged beside her, barking wildly at the cowering shapes inside. One by one, they poured out, stumbling and yelping, scattering into the smoky night. But then another sound, sharper, thinner. A high-pitched yelp deeper inside. Emily froze. "There's still one more." Michael turned. Through the veil of flame and smoke, he saw it, a tiny pup, no more than a few months old, huddled in the corner of a collapsing stall. The roof above sagged beams glowing red, seconds away from falling. Michael lurched forward, but his body betrayed him, his legs locking in agony. He collapsed to one knee, the heat pressing down, suffocating. And then Bean moved. The Malinois shot forward, a streak of muscle and determination, disappearing into the blaze, without hesitation. "No." Michael roared, his voice raw, breaking. "Bean, come back." But Bean didn't falter. The dog barreled through falling embers, teeth flashing as he seized the pup by its scruff. With strength born of pure loyalty, he turned and lunged back toward them. For one terrible second, Michael saw the roof above begin to give way, a fiery beam, plunging downward. Bean Michael's scream ripped from his chest, primal and desperate, a sound that clawed at the marrow of every person who heard it. The beam crashed. Flames erupted. And out of the inferno, Bean staggered the pup, dangling safely from his jaws. His coat was singed, patches of fur scorched black, but his eyes still burned with the fierce light of survival. He stumbled toward Michael, laid the pup gently at his feet, and collapsed. Emily's scream split the night. She dropped to her knees, hands clawing at Bean's body. "Dad, he's not moving, Bean. Please wake up." Michael's world narrowed to a tunnel. The roar of fire, the distant cries, the chaos of the town, rushing to help, all of it faded beneath the weight of that one sight: his dog, his brother in arms lying limp and broken. He fell beside Bean, hands shaking violently as he pressed against the dog's chest. "Don't you dare," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't you dare leave me." "Not you." He pounded his fists against the ground, his voice erupting into the smoke. "You hear me, damn it. You don't quit. Not now. Not ever. I swore I'd keep us together, and I'm not letting go." Emily's sobs tore at him. "Dad, save him." The pup whimpered weakly, pressing its tiny body against Bean, as if begging him back. Michael's tears fell hot onto Bean's singed fur. In his heart, a war raged, guilt, rage, fear. He thought of the nights Bean had kept him alive, when nightmares clawed at him, of the storm that had nearly taken them, but hadn't, because Bean refused to let go. And there, in the blaze of their burning dream, Michael swore aloud, his voice hoarse but unyielding, "I will rebuild this stronger than before. I will not let them break us. I swear it on my life, on my blood, on every breath I have left. No one will take this family from me. Not now. Not ever." Bean stirred. It was faint, just a twitch of muscle beneath Michael's hands. But it was enough. Emily gasped. "He's alive." Michael bent close, pressing his forehead against Bean's scorched fur. "That's it, soldier. Stay with me. Stay." The fire crews arrived, townsfolk shouting water, hissing against flame. Figures rushed in, Harold the carpenter, Clara, with soot streaking her cheeks, Carl the veteran, clutching a bucket in his shaking hands. They had come running when they saw the glow against the night sky, and now they formed a desperate brigade, dousing the fire, dragging beams clear, pulling Michael and Emily back from the collapsing structure. But Michael refused to release Bean. He cradled the dog against his chest, as if the act itself might tether him to life. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked on the retreating shadows beyond the fire. He knew the arsonists had watched. They wanted him to break. They wanted this sanctuary to vanish in smoke and ash. Instead, they had ignited something far more dangerous. The town gathered as the fire finally died to smoldering embers. The sanctuary was half destroyed. Beams, blackened kennels collapsed. But the dogs, every single one, had survived. And at the center of it all, Michael stood with Emily at his side, and Bean breathing faintly in his arms, a living emblem of sacrifice. He raised his head voice, carrying across the silent crowd. They tried to burn us down tonight. They thought we'd quit, that we'd crawl back into the dark. But I swear to you, we will rise from this. We will rebuild. And we will stand stronger than ever. Because this place isn't just wood and nails. It's blood and fire and family. And no one can destroy that. The crowd erupted not in cheers, but in a solemn chorus of assent. Heads nodded, eyes burned with resolve. What had been one man and his daughter's dream was now theirs too, forged in flame. Emily slipped her hand into her father's. Her eyes were still wet, her voice trembling, but it carried the weight of truth. We'll keep fighting, Dad. For them, for Bean, for everyone who needs this place. Michael squeezed her hand, tears streaming freely now. Together, he whispered. Always. Bean's tail twitched weakly, a single defiant motion. And in that moment, amid the ruins of fire and ash, the promise was sealed. Not just between a father and daughter, not just between a man and his dog, but between an entire community. A promise that no storm, no enemy, no fire could ever erase. The morning air was cool still, carrying the faint charred scent of what had once been their sanctuary. The fire had taken much, but not everything. Not Bean, not the dream. Days had stretched into weeks since that night, a blur of hospitals, ash-covered rubble, and hands blistered from rebuilding. Yet now, as the first light of dawn cut across the horizon, Michael wheeled himself through the gravel path that led to the new center. His breath caught in his chest. It was real. Where smoke once hung, fresh timber now rose. The kennel stood again, sturdier, wider, built not just by his hands and Emily's, but by an entire town that had chosen to believe. Faded scars of fire still marked the earth, but above them stretched something stronger, a place reborn from ruin. Inside, the sound that had once nearly been lost forever filled the air again, the chorus of barks, playful yips, tails thumping against wood and wire. Life had returned, and in the middle of it all, there was Bean. The Malinois limped slightly, the fur on his flanks scorched away to reveal a long, jagged scar. His body carried the memory of that night, every singed patch a testament to what he had endured. Yet his eyes were the same fierce, steady, unbroken. He moved with a quiet pride, scarred, but not defeated, the kind of survivor who carried his wounds like armor. Emily was with him, her small figure darting across the training yard, her whistle sharp and precise. She had grown in those weeks, shoulders squared with responsibility, voice clear with command. Bean obeyed her, instantly pivoting with precision, despite his limp guiding younger rescues through obstacle courses, coaxing frightened strays into trust. Michael watched from his chair, his chest tightening with something heavier than pride. It was all. His daughter had become the heartbeat of this sanctuary, and Bean its spirit. He saw in their movements the rhythm of survival, the dance of those who had been broken and refused to stay broken. Dad, look, Emily's voice rang across the yard, bright and unguarded, for the first time in too long. Bean cleared a hurdle with a clumsy grace, the scar along his side gleaming in the sunlight. The other dogs followed his lead tails, high-energy electric. Emily laughed, chasing after them, hair flying behind her like a banner of freedom. Michael smiled. It had been a long time since he'd heard that sound, the kind of laughter that wasn't forced through grief, but pure alive. He leaned back in his chair, letting the sun warm his face. For the first time in years, the weight of loss did not anchor him fully to the ground. The townspeople began to arrive, as they often did now. Clara, with her hands still calloused from carpentry, brought a basket of fresh bread. Harold followed behind, carrying new feed bins. Carl, the old veteran whose eyes once carried only shadows, now walked with a spring of purpose, leading a timid hound on a leash. He had been one of the first to come after the fire, offering not just his labor, but his heart. "Morning, Michael." Carl called, his voice steady. "The pup's name is Rosie. Thought I'd bring her here to learn from Bean." Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had seen what this place was doing, not just for the animals, but for the people. Men and women who had once drifted aimless through the edges of town now found themselves hammering, painting, feeding, laughing. They weren't just rescuing dogs. They were rescuing pieces of themselves. Emily knelt beside Rosie, her hands gentle, her voice soft. Bean hovered protectively near his scarred body, like a shield of reassurance. The pup wagged her tail timidly, then pressed against Emily's chest. Carl's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "Didn't think I'd feel this again," he murmured. "Didn't think I'd matter." Michael's hand gripped the wheel of his chair until his knuckles whitened. He knew that feeling all too well. the hollow silence of believing your life no longer had use. But here in this place, the silence had been filled again. Not by words, but by the thundering pause of life refusing to yield. The days passed into a rhythm. Michael, though confined to the chair, guided the structure with his mind and voice. Emily trained Bean led the dogs flourished. Each scar, Michael's crippled legs, Emily's grief, Bean's burned flank wove into a tapestry of resilience. One evening, as the sky deepened into amber and rose, Emily led Bean and a line of young rescues into the open field beyond the kennels. Michael followed slowly, wheels crunching against dirt. The horizon was a river of fire, but not the destructive kind. This was the sun setting, painting everything in gold. "Run, Bean!" Emily cried, unclipping his leash, and Bean ran. His limp gave rhythm to his stride, but it did not hold him back. He surged forward, tail high, ears streaming, his scar catching the light like a brand of triumph. The pups chased after him, barking in delight, scattering across the field in wild, joyous abandon. Emily ran too, her laughter ringing, her arms outstretched as if she might catch the sun itself. Michael stopped at the crest of the field, his chest aching with something so vast it seemed to consume him whole. He had been broken, beaten down, left to rot in shadows. He had believed his life was nothing but a series of losses. And yet here it was, the proof that even from fire and ruin, something greater could be born. He closed his eyes, whispering into the wind, though the words were for himself as much as for them. We are not left behind anymore. This is family. The last light of the sun lingered on Bean's scar on Emily's face, flushed with joy on the sanctuary, standing strong against the darkening sky. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Michael believed. Not in miracles, not in fate, but in the unbreakable truth carved by fire and love that family was not always blood. It was survival. It was sacrifice. It was choosing again and again to stand together in the face of every storm. As the sun sank fully, the sanctuary glowed with lantern light, dogs settling into calm, people lingering with quiet smiles. Michael sat with his daughter beside him, and Bean pressed against his wheels, the weight of the dog warm and solid. And in that silence beneath the scarred sky, he knew their story wasn't ending here. It was only beginning.